Narratives are often produced by someone in order to describe a course of a chain of events for various purposes, e.g., to inform, to educate, or to entertain. Responding to this form of description demands acts of understanding and reasoning that involve different cognitive powers which are not involved in investigations that are situated in contexts of exploration/discovery, where the issue may be to arrive at the formulation of a principle, rather than proceeding from a principle, as is the case in investigations situated in contexts of explanation/justification. In this latter case, what we are witnessing is a categorically driven conceptual investigation aiming, not primarily at description, but rather at larger concerns connected with second-order questions relating to why things are as they are, i.e. concerns related to truth/knowledge and justice/the good. In the case of the production and understanding of fictional narrative, we are more concerned with the dignity and worth of character than with a historical account of the forces of ruin and destruction ravaging our nations and civilizations. We know, for example, from the dramatic accounts of Shakespeare's Macbeth, that the ruin and destruction supposedly caused by Duncan may well have been fictional, but that fact nevertheless does not detract from the value of the play, which centers around an account of the deterioration of the mental health of a tyrannical ruler, similar to the one given in the later books of the Republic as part of an account of justice. Much can be learned in the process of appreciating this work, which involves a therapeutical cathartic play of the emotions of pity and fear. Ethical principles are also involved in a process which is clearly aiming at self-knowledge, and knowledge of the world and how it actually operates, rather than how it ought ideally to operate. For example, the Kantian principle, promises ought to be kept, does not say that it is a fact that promises are kept, but rather, in the case that they are not kept, this principle is invoked in relation to the categorical imperative to make the judgment that promises ought to be kept. The medium of fictional narrative centers around the key concept of mimesis, as understood by both Plato and Aristotle. For both philosophers, fictional narrative imitated the forms or ideas that formed the principles of understanding and reason, operating in the real world of the city, whether that be in the everyday milieu of the agora, or the more esoteric milieu of the offices and institutions of the modern city. The mimesis of these activities involves representing them for a purpose that is not real, but rather ideal, and related to the artist's intentions and the ideas he has about his art. Here there is a hylomorphic structure to this activity, but it has different material, efficient, formal and final causes or conditions compared to those we find in the real world. As mentioned above, ethical considerations, practical categories of understanding and principles of reason, are also important constitutive elements of the plot of the narrative of the tragic poet, and are an important part of his creative intentions. Techne and episteme are important aspects of the productive and theoretical sciences involved in this creative process. Phronesis, Dike and Arete are also involved, but have their home in the practical sciences. Understanding, therefore, must on such a complex account be a complex power operating at several different levels regulated by both the categories of the understanding and the principles of reason, e.g. principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason. The context of this artistic operation must be primarily that of explanation/justification and the question, why did X occur? If X is an action, demands a reason for the action, in contrast to the situation where X is an event, in which case the why question might be asking for a cause or condition. The reason for an action is teleological, and can either refer to the maxim for the action or the principle governing the action, e.g. the principle of happiness or self-love or the principle of the categorical imperative. Ricoeur wishes to relate the narrative structure of history to the above form of fictional narrative, and this is an important claim to make, given the inevitable relation of history to the beginnings, middles, and endings that are constitutive of the human life process. Both forms of narrative also concentrate attention upon actions and events of magnitude. In the case of history, it is the spatial entity of the city or nation and the temporal forces of ruin and destruction which threaten civilization, which is in focus. In the case of fictional narrative, we are concerned primarily with the fate of individuals, although the question of the flourishing life of the city or nation may also be the concern of the artist. One problematic claim made by Ricoeur in this context, however, is that the narrative of history is derivative from the fictional form of narrative whilst at the same time being rooted in the temporal structures of action. Ricoeur argues that history constructs its own temporality which refers to reality obliquely. Page 92. The reality being referred to is that of actual events that have taken place in the past. Part of the intentionality of historical thought is connected to its epistemological commitment to knowledge about the past, and also connected, from a practical point of view, with the powers of understanding and reason. This latter commitment occurred in the spirit of verity, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. In this field of praxis, history and law share many of the same concerns. Historical laws have, of course, a different logical structure than the laws of theoretical science, which relate to reality in the mode of necessity. Historical laws are norm constituting in the mode of the ought, of what ought to occur in reality, e.g. the future ought to resemble the past. This kind of law will also be integrated with ethical and political laws, relating to justice. The idea of event will be less important in the case of the ethical laws that are justified by the categorical imperative, which may take different forms, e.g. treat everyone as ends in themselves but which all imply action, so act. Ricoeur's characterization of an event, moreover, that a historical event is a one-time unique occurrence in the temporal history of civilizations, abstracts from all non-temporal characteristics and adopts the Cartesian spatio-temporal coordinate system, which is essentially a mathematical system designed to measure motion and physical change. Such a view is, then, the result of a mathematical view of time that is connected to an obsession with scientific methodology by English and German positivists. Ricoeur in fact criticizes this position, but nevertheless presents an account of event, which many positivists would embrace. Whether it be a question of statistical frequency, causal connection, or functional relation, an event is what only happens once. Page 97. In a discussion of the work of Aron and Weber, Ricoeur elaborates upon this position by quoting Aron. As for the probability born of the partial character of historical analyses and causal relations, it exists in our own minds, not in things. Page 98 in Ricoeur. Ricoeur continues in his reasoning. In this respect, historical appraisal of probability differs from the logic of the scientist and is closer to that of the judge. Page 98. This reasoning is then confronted with Moreau's claim, which rejects the proposition that historical understanding is subjective, as defined by the methodological individualism of many social scientists. Ricoeur's discussion takes on an atomistic character, and a formula is sought to relate the atoms of the event and the individual. The method used is one of dialectical confrontation. The question, is history the history of events or individuals? Is, of course, from the point of view of historical understanding, a poorly formulated question, which may well require abandoning the characterizations of event and the subjective-objective distinction referred to in this chapter. Ricoeur then introduces Hempel into the discussion. Hempels is a scientific view which rejects all connections of the idea of an event with narrative transfigurations. The event is depicted in terms of a universal particular relation in which historical events are no less mystically subsumed under a more general concept of event of a specific type, which, in turn, is logically related to antecedent conditions and so-called regularities. Clearly, the kind of universality invoked here is theoretical, but may well also be related to the assumption that the future will resemble the past. This attempted detachment of the practical intention, practical understanding, and practical reasoning from the historical conceptualization of historical events removed history from ethics and the practical sciences, and this was viewed with suspicion by many professional historians. Ricoeur criticizes the above account by Hempel on the grounds that it is too prescriptive. According to Ricoeur, history is not yet a fully developed science, and is therefore prone to idealistic characterizations. Both Ricoeur and Hempel agree that historical explanations are in some sense incomplete. Hempel followers settled upon a compromise position that history may not possess laws, but rather law-like principles which provide us with explanation sketches. This is not an action-focused account of history, which would, in fact, require consideration of the prescriptive form of imperative and a narrative motivated by reasons for actions rather than the causes of events. The criticism of Hempel offered by Ricoeur is that he fails to distinguish between a historical event and a physical event. Historical events, according to Ricoeur, are characterized in terms of singular statements that refer to the occurrence of unique occurrences at very specific and unique times and places. Such historical events cannot be the matter of narratives which clearly possess the logical characters of universality and necessity. This view of event does, however, allow Ricoeur to artificially attach a value to the occurrence and assign the event a cause, which the hermeneutic method can then interpret the meaning of. Here, what Ricoeur calls the terminal consequences, page 119, are important, but he also insists that there may well occur a conflict of interpretations in the assigning of terminal consequences in a causal chain. Marx is mentioned in the context of this discussion, and Ricoeur claims, either interpretation can be objective and true with regard to the causal sequences upon which it is elaborated. There is a place for critical pluralism. Page 119. It is, of course, not merely the dialectical materialism of Marx that is historically problematic, but also the fact that the ancient view of Dike, justice, is marginalized, as is the Enlightenment insistence upon the importance of the practical idea of freedom in important actions/events such as revolutions.